Greetings to everyone. Welcome to the CEC Gurukul lectures. In today's lecture, the theme of the discussion would be the making of womanhood. As you all know, there is a particular image of femininity, and especially with regard to Indian womanhood, that has been built over several generations and centuries. That image is either it is pious or it is cunning. So in today's lecture, there would be an attempt to question this monolithic imaging of women in early Indian societies. This has been done by various scholars like Shalini Shah, who has explored varied representations of women ranging from chaste wives, that means pure wives, to deviant or cunning women. So in studying the various myths, this lecture also attempts to analyze the basic morphology of patriarchal taming, both of the myth as well as its feminine character. So as you can see on the screen, in this book, The Making of Womanhood, the basic focus has been to study the conscientization of women, as to how the conscience of women was developed in such a way so as to self-discipline themselves. So as has been mentioned by Shalini Shah in her work, Molding Her Will. So the title Molding Her Will shows the manner in which women internalized the patriarchal attitudes and the whole ideology of Pativrata, which questioned their very individuality and existence. So as a result, the female agency came to be accepted as something which was corrupting and subversive, and something which could not be allowed. And the trend started from early Indian historical period, and it continues till date. So the very concept, the very idea of an independent woman or the female agency came to be questioned, came to be looked down upon as an idea that was subversive. So Shalini Shah has very carefully analyzed several passages of Mahabharata and has described a very interesting evolution of the whole idea, the whole concept of Apsaras, the celestial nymphs, and how there was a transition from the concept of goddesses to celestial prostitutes. And with the creation of patriarchy, how women came to be seen as evil, and they came to be projected as having negative qualities, and these negative qualities were largely attributed to the female biological and mental processes which were at work. So as a result, there was a whole discussion that developed on the theme of how this patriarchal identity formation took place, and as time progressed and as civilization became, it evolved, and there was an evolution from a community to a band society. There was also an increasing talk of rising promiscuity. So through the band society, though these band societies and these community groupings were made up of pairing families, but the pre or extramarital sex and the custom of sexual hospitality or partial promiscuity were acceptable norms, and this was largely because of the communal functioning of such groups. And as the band society gave way to the nuclear family, then it was the whole new system of norms that was devised, and then it was the family and the authority of the male member of the family which became real, and the family became the functional unit. So as a result of this transition from a band society to a family centered society, what happened during the course of this transition was the privatization of the feminine. So, women came to resemble slaves and serfs who also were deprived of fighting in the wars or in carrying the arms and the armaments. Their rising marginalization in the political arena and the privatization of the feminine functions like the breeder and feeder role of women made them homebound in a largely developing society which was moving towards greater specialization, greater class differentiation and rising complexity both in terms of society as well as economy. Then in another writing by Shalini Shah titled Love, Eroticism and Female Sexuality in Classical Sanskrit Literature, again there has been an analysis of the conception of Kam or sexuality in the early medieval classical Sanskrit literary tradition from a gender perspective. So, the book highlights that far from being a unitary homogeneous category with only a certain kind of sexual status, women and their sexuality have been conceived differently in different philosophical schools, whether they were Dharma Shastras or it was Kam Sutra or it was Lokayata philosophy or it was Tantricism or it was Ayurvedic or the other ascetic philosophies like Buddhism and Jainism. So, beautifully this different portrayal and this questioning of the unitary homogeneous category vis-a-vis women has been attempted. So, the author has further made a case for seeing the women and has also questioned as to how there was an attempt to posit the prostitute versus Kulavadhu. So, either a woman was a prostitute or she was a Kulvadhu, and that is a householder woman, a wife or a mother, and how both these there was a paradigm difference that was outlined time and again. So, the author has made a case for seeing the prostitute sexuality differently completely from that of a Kulavadhu, that is a householder woman. Now, the treatment of the sexual desire of Mayavinis or Rakshasis or Dakinis and Swarinis also places them in an altogether different category from the other women of patriarchy. So, therefore, this kind of a monolithic tendency to portray women as either pure or as impure with no shades of grey in between was an ideological formulation that was taking place in several textual and philosophical traditions. So, even if we minutely observe the poetic masculinity that was being represented in the literature, the masculine erotic tradition authored by the poets was generally associated with hegemonic masculinity in which women exist only as objects for exclusive male erotic stimulation, something that was largely portrayed in the Shringar Ras. So, it was hardly the female oriented depiction or the female oriented discourse that was an important subject matter of various Shringar Ras compositions. So, the idea that was gradually emerging and the idea that was gradually being reinforced was that of the chaste widows or the cunning wives. So, the widowhood had to be pure and it had to be kind of a time spent in chastity, whereas the wives were largely portrayed as cunning and who needed to be controlled. So, Manusmriti accorded the central place to the wife in the whole system of perpetuating the social order, and also in enabling the men to gain immortality through their progeny. So, this very concept of gaining immortality through sons became very crucial, and it was a husband's duty to harness, to work upon the wife's reproductive power, so that this progeny could result in attainment of immortality. Now, this whole concept of subordination of reproductive power also can be understood from this in this background. So, the reproductive power of women was the one power that was exclusive to women and was the basis of the new structure of relations which were emerging in society. The several religious texts, the law codes, as well as the contemporary literature of early India exaggerated and treated it as an extremely dangerous power if it was not channelized properly, if that power was not given the right direction and it was not controlled by the husband, then that reproductive power could very well bring about Kali Yuga. Now, another very interesting description that has come out of an in-depth study of several feminist scholars is a discussion on the women's innate nature that was described as lustful. So, if one goes through the several narratives of epics like Mahabharata, then there are several stories which paint this kind of a picture of women as being lustful, as not being, morally and spiritually of a higher level. So, the story of Ashtavakra that was narrated by Bhishma to Yudhishthir illustrates this kind of a destructive and demoniac lust of women, which is considered to be their true nature. So, these terms, like the destructive power of women, or a woman having the capacity to devour men like a demon, these were very common references, and a female ascetic to whom Ashtavakra is sent to gain knowledge repeatedly attempts to seduce him in spite of her advancing age. So, here this story clearly indicates that how a woman, even if she is old, she is becoming mature, and she is also an ascetic, then also there are all the chances that she will go haywire and she would fall prey to to so many attractions. So, here this woman tells Ashtavakra that for women there is no greater delight nor more destructive urge than sex, that even very old women are consumed by the sexual desire, and that a woman's passion can never be overcome in all the three worlds. So, this kind of a depiction of women, even old women, in Mahabharata shows that the kind of broader image regarding femininity and womanhood that existed. Then there were several vices, several shortcomings, several evil practices that were associated with women, and one such vice was adultery. So, here again there is a reference to the Asata Manta Jataka, where even an old woman is described as a sexual hazard and prone to adulterous relations. So, the whole narrative literature of the Buddhists focused on the wives of kings and Brahmanas, and occasionally also these stories dealt with Gahapatis, who were among the dominant sections of society, and they were also quite well off. So, what was the kind of image or folklore that was built around such wives? For example, in the Bandhana Mokha Jataka, the king's wife lays very strict conditions of fidelity upon her husband, but herself breaks all the promises and she got involved with a series of messengers, and there were as many as 64 messengers that were sent by the king to inquire about the well-being of the queen in the king's absence. The king had gone away to fight wars, and both of them had promised each other that they would not indulge in anything evil. But here there is a story of a wife who breaks the promise, and so she gets involved with whatever messenger comes to inquire about the well-being of the king. So this story clearly appears to be a fabrication, and clearly there is an attempt to project women in a particular light. Now there are several forms of coercion that were used in ancient Indian historical period, and Shalini Shah deals with the problem of cultural production of patriarchy and its connection both with production as well as political processes. So Shalini Shah has argued that different kind of coercion means force, different kind of force that was used to imbibe better behavior in women. And these different kind of coercion it could be physical, it could be social, legal, psychological. So they were used all like Sam, Dam, Dand, Bhed. And women were excluded from war and training, which constituted an important element in the definition of masculinity. Now let us discuss what were the different mechanisms of control that were devised from time to time in order to control this innate nature of women. Now in the category of psychological, one can mention the concept of Istri Dharma. So this was the first method, that is ideological method, through which Istri Dharma or Pativrata Dharma, this notion was developed, and it was not only developed, rather it was to be internalized by women who attempted to live up to the idea of an ideal woman. And this was gradually constructed by the several ideologues of the society in a time-bound manner. So the key factor in this psychological motivation of women was the very naturalization of ideological mechanism. So the ideal of Pativrata was one of the most successful ideologies that was constructed over a period of time by any patriarchal system. And why it was the most successful ideology and technology? Because in this, women would themselves control their own sexuality, they would themselves control their own desires, and so the end result would be achieved on its own. So the Istri Dharma was an ideological mechanism for socially controlling the biological aspect of femininity that made them wild and untamed. So the whole notion of women being wild and untamed by nature was accepted even by women themselves. So they had to adopt the concept of Istri Dharma, they had to internalize it, and it was through Istri Dharma that women would be converted into a social entity in whom the biological as well as the cultural as well as the psychological has been tamed and domesticated. So very successfully this internalization of chastity, the concept of purity, was imbibed, and here there are several references in Manusmriti. For example, no man can completely guard a woman by force. This was a statement that was made by Manu. So women must guard over themselves by controlling their thoughts, speech and actions, and such women dwell with their husbands after death in heaven and are called sadhvi or a faithful wife. So this was the whole philosophy that was developed in order to promote internalization of chastity, and it was in this background that one can clearly understand the ideology of pativrata as the specific dharma of the wife, which became the ideology by which women aspired to purity and wifely fidelity, wifely duties as the highest expression of their selfhood. So, it came to be viewed as the means of salvation and was therefore to be self-imposed, because only through pativrata dharma, only by following that path could a woman achieve salvation. So, that personal, that selfish motive was also added to this whole ideology, and this was how their uncontrolled sexuality was perceived as posing a threat in both the narrative as well as the normative literature of early India. And there are series of references to the wickedness of women and of their insatiable lust that has been described at length by the great scholar Uma Chakravarti. Now, as has been mentioned by Uma Chakravarti, the concept of Kali age or Kali Yuga can also be clearly understood with this kind of an explanation. So, there was a whole inversion of the system in which women would lapse into unrestrained behavior. They would disregard the pativrata dharam, the istri dharam, and they would throw off all the morals. And what will happen? As a result, the wicked and the essential nature of women would go uncontrolled. So, therefore, if Kali Yuga had to be avoided, then that nature had to be subordinated, and it had to be subordinated, it had to be replaced by the virtue of the ideal wife. Now, we come to the second mechanism of control. What was the second mechanism of control that was devised? That was the social mechanism, that is the institution of family, the institution of husband as a mechanism of control, and there are a series of narratives for this. The power to use violence vests in the husband, and it was recommended as a means to ensure control over the wife's sexuality in particular and in monitoring her behavior generally. So, therefore, there was a certain legality that was ascribed to violent behavior by men over their wives. And there are a series of Jatak Kathas that kind of bear testimony to this. So, there was a construction of notion of womanhood which epitomized wifely fidelity, as in the case of the great characters of Sita, Savitri, Anasuya, Arundhati, etc. And the Kosiya Jataka tells us that an evil wife of a good Brahmana would spend her nights in roaming about, and she would kind of behave as if she was ill during the day, and she would not do any work. So, this was the kind of story that was narrated by the Kosiya Jataka, and the Brahmana was advised to assert his control over her by giving her some kind of a punishment like a pickled cow dung to eat, and then taking a rope or a stick and threatening the wife with either swallowing that pickle or working for her food. So, this ultimately paid off, and the husband was ultimately successful in converting his wife into a dutiful one. So, this was clearly a validation of the authority of the physical control of the husband over the wife. Then the third mechanism of control that was discussed was the politico-legal, that is how the kings could also behave as control mechanism. And if husbands do not succeed, this was the third mechanism of control whereby the state could use the coercive power and the patriarchal state could exercise its authority to chastise those wives who flouted the ideological norms. And once the tension between the nature and culture was resolved, then women would emerge as the paragons of virtue. So, the ultimate social control was achieved when the subordinated not only accepted their condition, but also considered it as a mark of distinction. So soon women started considering themselves to be ideally that they had to be a pativrata nari, and this Istri Dharam had to be followed at all costs. And Arth Shastra came to play a very important role in this entire ideology. Arth Shastra regulates the punishment that was enforced by the male kinsmen in inculcating, in encouraging this modest behavior. So Kautilya writes that one can strike the back of a woman 3 times with either a split bamboo cane or a rope, or else by the hand. And if any offense that was conducted at night, then the fine was to be doubled. Okay, so the most serious offenses were considered as talking to other men, and also visiting anyone's house without taking the permission of the male member of the family, and the whipping was to be done not privately but publicly in front of entire village. So the violent treatment was prescribed for the wife who enjoyed herself outside the homes, and the wives who indulged in drinking or even a pleasure trip with other women were to pay fines ranging from 3 to 6 panas. So you now have a fairly good idea as to the kind of image that was constructed of women in during early Indian historical period, and how the textual tradition kind of validated this very image. Thank you.